In this video today, I'll show you what are the main challenges with ISO 27001 risk assessment and treatment, and how to use a tool like Conformio to speed this risk management up. Now, the main purpose of risk assessment is to find out what problems can happen with your information or data. In other words, which bad things can happen to your digital assets. And then risk treatment is here to actually find out what kind of safeguards or controls you can use to mitigate those risks that you have found. In other words, this risk management is basically the starting point for building up your security posture. And I'll show you now what steps you need to take to assess and treat risks using Conformio software. As you can see, this risk register takes you through 7 main steps in this process of risk assessment and treatment. So the first one is assets, where you have to list all of your assets within your company. It already suggests several assets, and you can simply pick the ones that you think are relevant to you. So the first category is infrastructure, then you see IT communication equipment, software and databases, other documents and data, human resources, also third-party services like Gmail and other cloud services. And then when you click next, you come to this vulnerabilities part, where you actually select what are the relevant vulnerabilities for the assets that you have selected in the previous screen. So for office and rooms and facilities, you select various vulnerabilities that you think are appropriate for your company, and then you do this for each and every asset that you have selected. And then you click next, and you move on to threats. And basically, this is the whole idea of this asset-based risk assessment, where you combine the assets with their related vulnerabilities, and then this combination of assets and vulnerabilities enables potential threats to materialize. And this is where you actually select all the relevant threats. Again, software suggests you some threats that are relevant for this particular combination of vulnerability and asset. And then, of course, you can select or unselect any of these items here. You can also add any new threats that you see as relevant. Once you click next, you come to this evaluation part. So basically, this is where you have to assess the level, how big these risks are. And again, basically the risk is the combination of asset and vulnerability and threat. So let's see, the first one is production facilities, vulnerability is this one, the threat is this one, and then you actually have to select what is the level here. And as you will see, you can actually select from the scale of low, medium and high, and then the risk is calculated automatically. And then you do it for each and every risk that you identified here. And as you will notice, some risks are acceptable, some risks are not acceptable. And I'll come to these level of risks a little bit later in this video. So let's add a level here for the risk. And then we click next. This is where we have to review all of these risks and confirm them. And we simply select all and then mark all risks as reviewed. And then we move on to the next screen. And this is where we have to find out what are the safeguards or controls that are going to be used for each and every of these risks. And you will notice that in this step, we're seeing only the risks that are not acceptable, so that are level 3 and 4, if we use these scales for impact and likelihood. So for this particular risk here, you will see that the software automatically suggests all of these controls here, which are the most relevant in this particular case because of these particular assets and because of these vulnerabilities and threats. And here, of course, you can uncheck any of these, but you can also add some of your own controls from the NXA. Okay, once we click next, and then we simply click this confirm treatment for this risk. And basically, this is how we do it. If I click now this next button, then this risk treatment would be sent to all risk owners, and then risk owners would have to confirm these risks and also this way of treating them. Now, if you're wondering how many risks do you have to identify, this really depends on the size of your company. So if you are a very small company, only a couple of employees, then only a couple of dozen risks will be enough. Whereas if you are a company of a couple of hundred employees, then you can list up to, I don't know, 500, maybe even 1,000 risks. Now let me show you how this number of risks can multiply very quickly if you're not careful enough. So let's say that under assets here we pick a new asset, cabinets, and then we click next, and then let's search for these cabinets here. Okay, then we have suggested like a dozen of vulnerabilities, and let's pick all of these vulnerabilities that are suggested here. And then we move on to the threats. And again, let's see where these cabinets are and where these threats are. For each of these vulnerabilities, you see several threats. So for this first vulnerability, you have all these threats here. Let me pick all of them. Now, just for you to understand, we had one asset and then we had a dozen vulnerabilities. And then for the first vulnerability, we actually have what, 6 threats. And if we select 6 threats for each of these dozen vulnerabilities, you would have 6 times dozen. This is more than 70 new risks only for one asset, right? So what you have to keep in mind is that you don't have to select all of these vulnerabilities. You don't have to select all of these threats. You should be only selecting the ones that are really relevant, the most relevant, because otherwise you will simply have a huge number of risks, which is simply not necessary, especially if you are a smaller company. Now, when it comes to unacceptable risks, so the risks that are too high to be accepted, you should have, I would say, at least 10% of such risks, and up to maybe 20% of your total risks should be unacceptable. Because if you didn't have any unacceptable risks, this would mean that you have a perfect security, and this is something that does not really exist in reality. I would say that the certification auditor would expect you to have at least 10% unacceptable risks. Okay, so here in Conformio, when you select these scales from 0 to 2, you're actually selecting the scales of low, medium, and high. So let's say that I select, let's say, medium and medium. This will produce the level of risk of 2. So basically it's added impact plus likelihood, right? If I go for impact high, 2, and likelihood 1 medium, then 2 plus 1 is 3, which is then in this case not acceptable risk. And then again, if I decrease this to 0, then it becomes acceptable. So again, don't be afraid of having these 3s and 4s not acceptable, because this is something that the certification auditor will be expecting. ISO 27001 allows you to use any type of scales for assessing the risks. So you've seen this low, medium, and high, which means 0, 1, and 2, but you could also have some other scales like scales from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, depending on really what you see fit. However, you have to bear in mind that the more complex the scale, the more time your employees will need to do this risk assessment. So you see, when you have the selection only between 3 items, actually you make much quicker decisions rather than, let's say, having 5 items here. If I had here something like very low and then medium and then high and very high, I would spend probably 30 or 40% more time per each risk, which then only makes the whole risk assessment longer, but not necessarily much better. So in any case, this is why we suggest for smaller companies to use these smaller scale. If you're wondering how will your employees know whether to select high, medium, or low, impact or likelihood, this is basically done through 2 ways. First one is to show them the risk assessment methodology, where this scale needs to be specified and explained. And also you should perform a short training for these people so that they actually know how to use this in practice, and provide them with a couple of examples of risks and when to use high or medium or low for impact and likelihood. And here in Conformio, you can very easily see the explanation for impact and likelihood by clicking this info tooltip. Here you can see basically the repetition of what is written already in your risk assessment methodology. When it comes to choosing the appropriate controls to mitigate a certain risk, you should basically go for the ones that there is I would say, a direct correlation between the risk. So for example, if you have, let's say, your files as an asset, and you have a threat of losing these files because of the vulnerability that something can go wrong with the server, then a backup is one of the obvious controls to mitigate this kind of a risk. So here in Conformio, the best thing is really to use these controls that are suggested for each and every risk, because these controls are basically confirmed by our experts that are the most appropriate for this combination of assets and threats and vulnerabilities. Of course, if you see any controls that are not relevant for you, you can simply uncheck them. So if you start unchecking any of these controls, you will notice that the residual risk goes higher and higher, which is not something that you want. So the best thing is really to leave these controls as they are here, because ultimately when you come to the step of statement of applicability, then you can decide later on not to implement some of these controls, even though there is a relevant risk, but you can always decide that this control is really not necessary for treating that risk in the statement of applicability. So not here, rather later on. So to conclude, as you can see, this risk assessment and treatment basically gives you a comprehensive way to find out what can happen to your data and then to fix these problems before they happen. And this is why ISO 27001 insists on doing this process thoroughly and before you actually start implementing those controls. So make sure that you do this risk management properly, not only to satisfy the auditor, but also to protect your business. Hope this was helpful, and to sign up for a free trial of Conformio, click the link that you'll find in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel not to miss any new videos, and I publish videos on ISO 27001 every week. Thanks for watching!